In a valley, frozen solid, one family shivered through another night without fire. But just a quarter-mile away, William Reeves pressed his palm against a long clay bench that radiated warmth like a sleeping animal. He had burned nothing but twigs all evening. What kept him alive while others froze was a secret few believed. This is the story of how one man's grief built a heater that could burn all night on a handful of sticks, and how that invention shattered a timber merchant's empire when the temperature plunged to 40 below. But first, you need to understand why William Reeves built it at all. 5 years earlier, his cabin had held a different kind of warmth. Then, winter took the one person he loved, and a timber merchant named Richard Carver watched the price of every log rise. That winter, his wife Ella took sick with a cough that hollowed her out night after night.
I watched the woodpile shrink and knew we couldn't afford more. Mr. Carver, I can pay you in spring, just enough to keep her warm.
Credit is for fools. Pay in full or freeze. Winter doesn't wait on charity.
William walked home through the snow with empty hands and a colder kind of fear. Ella died before the first thaw, her body too weak to fight a cabin that couldn't hold heat. He buried her on a frozen hillside, each shovelful of dirt a promise he would not speak aloud.
I won't let another winter steal someone just because firewood costs more than a man can earn.
That single vow would drive him to build what valley folk later mocked as a mud couch, a bench that held fire's heat like a stone under a blanket.
I will build a fire that holds through the night without buying a single log.
William attacked the frozen riverbank with a shovel, hauling clay back to his cabin before dusk. Inside, he mixed the clay with sand and straw, stomping the pile with bare feet until it turned to paste. He began sculpting a long bench with a hollow serpentine path running through its core. 2 neighbors stopped outside his window, staring at the long mound of wet clay. They called it a mud couch and swapped jokes that carried through the thin walls.
Laugh while you can. This mud, once fired, will outlast every woodpile in the valley.
When his brother Joseph appeared in the doorway, the laughter had already spread through the valley.
William, you can't heat a cabin with dirt. Everyone's saying you've cracked.
They said the same when I married Ella. She kept me warm just fine.
Joseph left without another word, but at the gate he glanced back at the long mound of clay. After a week of curing, William opened the bench's small firebox and fed it a handful of dry twigs. Flames licked into the hidden serpentine flue, smoke twisting through the clay before vanishing up the chimney. An hour later, he laid his palm on the clay surface and felt warmth spreading beneath his hand. Joseph returned 2 days later, stepping into the cabin and stopping short at the wall of dry heat.
William, it's actually warm. How long has the fire been out?
Since dawn. The clay holds what the fire gives.
You burned twigs. I hauled 2 cords this week, and my cabin was cold by midnight.
Word of the bench's strange heat reached Richard Carver before the week was out.
A clay stove. It'll crack in the first hard freeze, or choke a man with smoke. Dangerous nonsense.
But William only added another dry twig to the firebox and watched the flame curl into the flue. The first hard freeze of winter dropped the valley to 0. In the neighboring cabin, frost swallowed the windows whole. William walked to the edge of the pines and scooped a double handful of dead twigs from under the snow. That was his fuel. A neighbor passed on the trail, bent beneath a sled loaded with split oak, wood he had paid Richard Carver dearly for. Inside William's cabin, Joseph sat on the clay bench and peeled off his gloves. The surface was warm as a living flank.
I checked the firebox. There's nothing but ash. How is this bench still throwing heat?
Clay remembers. It doesn't let the warmth die any more than I let go of Ella.
That mud couch can't be safe. No proper stovepipe. I've heard it smolders all night, filling the house with poison.
Some men, already straining under the cost of wood, glanced at William's smoke-free chimney and wondered if Carver was protecting something besides safety. That night, William's cabin glowed like a banked ember while the wind cut through every other home. He added only 3 twigs to the firebox, then rested his head against the warm clay and slept. A neighbor named Hank, desperate to dodge Carver's prices, tried to copy the bench from memory. He shaped a shallow flue with no slope, packed the clay too wet and lit it before it cured. By nightfall, cracks split the bench like an eggshell. Smoke boiled into the room, and a stray ember licked the floor. Hank smothered the flames with a wool blanket, but his burned hands and the fear in his voice spread faster than the fire.
Reeves' mad contraption nearly killed a man. No clay heap should be allowed inside a dwelling. Tear it out before another house burns.
Within a day, Richard had gathered a crowd outside the general store. He held up Hank's bandaged hands like a trophy.
He isn't fighting the truth. He is fighting the one thing that breaks his grip on the valley.
Men who had measured their woodpile in cords now measured William with narrowed eyes. Neighbors stopped answering his wave. Joseph pleaded that a botched copy was not proof of anything, but Richard's voice carried farther, and money still bought ears. By the end of the week, a petition circulated. Any heat source other than a certified iron stove must be torn down. The petition forced a meeting in the drafty town hall where men stamped their feet against the cold and against William Reeves.
That clay bench is a trap. It will smoke, catch fire, and kill. Tear it out tonight, or the council will.
He wants to take away the only thing that kept a cold cabin from killing someone else.
It wasn't the bench that failed. Hank built it wrong. My brother's design has kept him warm on Twigs for weeks.
And who will guarantee every fool builds it right? You, Joseph, stake your livelihood on his mud couch?
If I speak louder, Carver will blacklist me. I'll never haul again. But if I stay silent, William stands alone.
Joseph's voice died in his throat, and the hall filled with Richard's satisfied silence. No one spoke for William.
I won't tear it out. That bench cost only clay and labor, and it kept me alive. You can petition all winter. I won't let another person freeze.
He walked out into the snow without waiting for a vote, the door slamming behind him.
He just killed any chance of mercy, and I let him walk out alone.
William continued to feed the firebox each morning, and the bench held its warmth like a promise no petition could break. He ignored the paper nailed outside the post office. His only reply was the steady amber glow that never left his window. Joseph could not sleep. Every cold night in his own bare cabin sharpened the shame of his silence.
He carried this alone because I was a coward. I can't stand beside him in words, but I can stand beside him in clay.
In the dead hours after midnight, he dug frozen clay from the same riverbank and mixed it by lantern light. He copied every bend of William's flue, laying wet clay over a core of sand and straw until a second bench took shape. Richard saw only what he wanted to see. A valley still tethered to his woodpiles, every axe stroke another coin in his purse.
That mud couch will be rubble before the first big snow. Let Reeves freeze alone. His fad won't survive one real storm.
Snow piled past the windowsills, and the cold deepened, but Richard only raised his prices again. In the thick blue dark, two cabins now held a hidden fire. One the valley mocked, the other it did not know existed. When the second cold snap sheared the valley, Joseph's clay bench had cured hard as stone. He lit a handful of twigs in the tiny firebox and sat back against the wall.
The heat rose the same way it had in William's cabin. Slow, deep, and stubborn.
Before the sun set, he pulled two neighbors inside and told them to put their hands on the clay. They felt the heat spreading through the bench long after the twigs had turned to ash. One of them whispered that it was the first warm evening they had spent without stoking a fire every hour. Richard Carver heard the whispers before noon and stormed out of his office toward the woodyard.
He is poisoning the valley with false hope. Wood still costs what it costs, and from today, what it costs has doubled.
The price hike crushed those already struggling, but it planted a dangerous seed of doubt in men who had watched their woodpile disappear. And as the night fell, the barometer in the general store nudged another point lower, toward the number no one in the valley had ever seen. A rider brought the forecast from the rail station. The coldest wind in 50 years was descending from the north.
You heard the forecast. Buy now or freeze. I have the only heat left in this valley.
That bench takes nothing but twigs. I can show you the lay of the flue. It costs you nothing.
Joseph gathered dry brush and kindling from under the pines. then filled a box in his cabin with hours of silent heat.
Let them panic. Every cord that rolls from my yard is a nail in Reeves' reputation.
The barometer dropped through numbers the valley had never worn on its glass.
Let the thermometer fall. Ella already taught me what cold can steal. I've built the only fire that night can't take.
It will hold, William. I built it exactly as you said.
Then the horizon swallowed the last daylight, and the wind turned from its old path toward a place no one wanted to be. The first flake of the storm that would write every name into the valley's memory was already falling. The storm did not come gently. It fell on the valley like a second night, wind peeling the ridge raw and burying the trail under white. By midnight, the thermometer outside the post office had fallen past, every number marked on its face, to 40 below. Inside a dozen homes, families fed whole logs into iron stoves only to feel the metal cool before the hour was up. William added a handful of twigs to the firebox and watched the flame curl into the clay flue as if it had found home.
The clay never forgets the fire. It holds what the storm tries to steal.
In Joseph's cabin, the same stubborn warmth pressed against the walls, and he could lay his bare hand on the bench without flinching.
It's holding. Every twig I fed it is still here, pushing back against the cold.
But beyond those two cabins, men heard their stovepipes groan and watched the fire die long before dawn, the cold claiming every room. William's window stayed clear of frost. The bench threw heat from its entire length, even when the firebox held nothing but ember, and the storm, still young, tightened its grip on the valley as if it meant to break every man who had traded faith for wood. By the second dawn, nothing remained of the woodpiles but scattered bark and frozen sawdust. In cabin after cabin, the last log burned out and left only a cold stove and colder breath. One family never woke. A neighbor found them under thin blankets, the stove dead, their faces still dead, their faces still. At Carver's yard, the shelves stood bare. The last sled had gone before midnight. No more wood would come.
My ledger means nothing. The storm took wood, customers, and the lie that I kept the valley warm.
When he stumbled home, his grand house was a tomb. The fireplace gaped black, the wood rack empty.
The cold doesn't care about my pride. It'll take me like it took Reeves' wife.
Outside, the wind shrieked, and somewhere in the white dark, William's bench glowed on a handful of twigs. Carver watched frost swallow his window and finally understood the truth he had fought to bury. The bench worked, but too late for the families lost, and too late for the man who had sold their safety. On the third day, William and Joseph wrapped their faces and pushed through the blowing white to the nearest cold cabins. They pulled a shivering family into William's cabin, where the bench still radiated a stubborn, dry heat.
Sit on the clay. It'll hold the warmth longer than any stove.
Carver shouted my brother down, but this bench is proof he was wrong.
Miles away in his frozen parlor, Carver sat with the truth pressing against his ribs, heavier than the cold.
I buried Reeves so deep I never saw the ice closing over my own roof.
The frost devoured the last clear pane of his window, and he understood he would not survive another night.
There is only one man in this valley with heat, and I tried to destroy him.
The storm howled around his door, but pride kept his hand from the latch. Outside, the wind carried a sound like a dying animal, and Carver finally knew it was his own. Pride held him motionless for a long moment, but the frost sinking into his lungs was louder. He pushed the door open and the storm swallowed him whole.
He walked toward the only glow in the valley, toward the man he had mocked, and each step cost what remained of his pride.
The cold bit through his coat, but the glow of William's bench was a small amber star drawing him forward. He fell against the door, ice cracking from his coat, and pounded the frozen wood with a fist that could barely close. William opened the door to a shape that looked less like a man than a ghost. The storm had spit out. Carver's legs gave way before he could form a word, and he landed on his knees in the frozen snow.
Reeves, I have nothing left, no wood, no coin, no pride. Let me inside. I know what I did. I know I let your wife freeze, but I am begging.
William did not move. He only watched, the the warm light from his cabin, carving a sharp line across the frozen man at his door.
I don't want your coin, Carver. Money never kept anyone warm at 40 below, and it won't start now. I'll build you a bench, but you will teach every family in this valley how to build one, free of charge.
Richard's reply came before William finished, the words tearing out of a throat half frozen with shame and frost.
Yes, I'll teach them all. For nothing. I swear it on what little I have left, which is nothing.
William pulled him inside, then took his hand, the grip locking the promise tighter than any contract.
The mud doesn't care about your past, only that you shape it right. You'll learn starting tomorrow.
Richard stared at the bench, the warmth now a promise instead of a rebuke, and his hands began to stop shaking. Then William began explaining the flu, and for the first time, Carver listened without measuring the cost. Outside, the storm howled, but inside, two men were building something stronger than a bench, a new way for the valley. The handshake that sealed it had already dried, but the warmth it promised would last far longer than the storm. William and Joseph crossed the storm with arms full of clay and straw, arriving at Richard's frozen house to begin the work.
You'll shape the flue yourself. Those hands that counted coin will learn what clay remembers.
Richard's first attempt was clumsy, but Joseph knelt beside him and showed how to smooth the channel with a flat stone.
My fingers are numb, but the mud is warmer than the gold I hoarded.
By evening, a simple bench lay along the wall, and William knelt to feed the first handful of twigs into the small firebox.
Now watch how the clay keeps what the flame gives.
The heat crept through the hidden flue, and the whole bench began to radiate a slow, stubborn warmth. Richard put his palm on the clay and felt the warmth soak into bones that had been frozen for days.
I sold a mountain of wood, but this handful of twigs feels heavier than all of it.
Outside, the storm still clawed at the valley, but inside, the first small fire of a changed life was burning. When the wind finally eased, Richard walked to the drafty town hall and nailed a notice, "Free bench. Every family can learn."
I've sold wood at a profit while your family shivered. I was wrong. Let me show you what a handful of twigs can do.
William and Joseph knelt beside a heap of clay and demonstrated the winding flue, while Richard passed the straw himself. A man who once signed the petition spat on the floor and muttered it was all a trick.
This isn't a sale. There is no cost. Touch the clay. It's already warmer than my ledger ever was.
Before the next sunset, 3 families had begun molding their own benches, guided by the man they once feared. Each evening, amber windows multiplied across the valley, fed by nothing but twigs and the stubborn clay.
She would have lived if this had come sooner, but her death planted a fire that's lighting the whole valley.
Richard, his hands finally fitting the clay rather than counting coins, knelt beside a child to show the gentle slope of the flue, and the valley, once divided by the cost of warmth, began to rebuild itself on a foundation of clay and second chances. When the last hard freeze finally broke, the valley thawed into something it had not been in years, a place where no family buried its dead because of cold. Richard Carver never opened his lumber ledger again. Instead, he kept a different tally, the number of cabins that glowed each night.
Every bench I teach is one less family I can't betray. I am not building my name. I am burying it.
I never thought I'd see the day Carver's hands were cleaner than his coin.
Clay changes a man. It did the same to me.
The slope must be gentle, child. Heat doesn't like a steep climb. It wants to rest in the clay.
And so the winter passed without another frozen body, the clay benches holding the heat of tiny fires like a promise kept. A woman who had once signed the petition now told her neighbors that Carver had given her children a warmer home than any iron stove. William watched from the door of his cabin, the evening light catching the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. He still walked to the wood's edge for twigs, but now he did it with the quiet satisfaction that the cold would never win again. On the first soft day, William walked to the hillside, where he'd buried Ella 5 winters past. The stone marker stood, edges worn, but the snow around it had melted to dark earth.
I kept my promise, Ella. A handful of twigs now warms a cabin all night. The valley that lets you freeze won't let anyone else die cold again.
He knelt, pressing his palm against the stone, and for a long moment only the wind answered.
Carver teaches the design free now. The man who refused you credit is begging people to learn. I didn't just build a bench, I built the only thing that could have saved you.
The sun broke through the clouds, and the last frost melted from the marker. William rose, his hand lingering on the stone as if to pass the bench's warmth into the ground. Then he turned toward the valley, watched the chimneys carrying smoke, and walked home at peace. 10 winters later, Richard Carver knelt in a workshop lit by a dozen clay benches, his beard white, his hands still shaping flues.
The flue doesn't have to be beautiful, boy. It just has to let the heat wander before it leaves.
He no longer called it a mud couch or a dangerous heap. He called it the Reeves heater, and he taught it for free in every home. Outside the workshop, William stood in the shadow of a pine, his own hair now gray, watching the new generation learn.
It's not mine anymore. It belongs to the valley. That's what I wanted.
He didn't enter. He only watched until a young apprentice smiled at something Carver said, then turned and walked away.
Reeves never charged me a penny. He asked only that I become the man I should have been.
And so the method spread beyond that valley, carried by families who had once feared the cold. The clay bench, the mud couch they had mocked, warmed 100 homes long after William and Richard were dust. And on the coldest nights, when the wind bit deep and frost chased the windows, a handful of twigs still held the dark at bay. The lesson was simple. Thick clay holds what the fire gives. Long after the failing finish naturally, a handful of twigs, fed into a small box, can warm a home all night. The bench is not a stove. It is a battery of earth, storing the sun's echo in its bones. And every time you add a twig, you are not burning wood. You are charging the clay. Past midnight, when the iron stove has gone cold, the clay is only beginning to give back. It does not roar. It does not crackle. It simply stays warm, like ground still holding the heat of a buried sun. The wind can take wood, coin, and pride, but it cannot take what the clay remembers. William Reeves understood that, and because he did, a valley stopped freezing. The clay bench still sits in countless homes, radiating a quiet warmth that asks nothing but a handful of twigs. And as the fire dies to embers, the clay still holds, still warm, still patient, still enough. Inside the dark cabin, the long clay bench still glowed with a low, steady heat. Its surface was warm to the touch, even though the firebox held only embers. Outside, through the frosted window, the blizzard swept the valley in a white fury, but the glass did not feel the cold. The bench pushed back with a patient amber light. A single twig, added at midnight, still lingered in the clay's memory. The flakes tapped against the pane, dying without ever reaching the room. All night, the bench asked for nothing more than what the forest floor gave freely, and so the cabin stayed warm, not because the fire was large, but because the clay was faithful. On the coldest night, a handful of twigs was enough. The camera pulls back through the frost, into the snow, and the light fades to black.